And we are live. Okay, welcome to the show. You guys see the title? Did Ukraine ever have nuclear weapons? The answer is no. And the reason that I wanted to make a show about this is because there's a lot of talking heads in the media that says, "Oh, why did if Ukraine never had given up their nuclear weapons, they wouldn't be in this situation." But the thing is, they never did. Now, technically, they had nuclear weapons on their land right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they didn't have the codes to launch those nuclear weapons. They never did, right? And a lot of people in the media are saying, "Oh, they gave up the nuclear weapons, and then the 1994 um, Budapest memorandum." It basically states that the U.S., the UK, and the US, the UK, yeah, and somewhat France and China, but it was weaker, saying that they will protect not only Ukraine but Belarus and Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, right? If they gave up their nuclear weapons because they were part of the Soviet Union, and once the Soviet Union collapsed, they technically had nuclear weapons on their land, but they couldn't launch. They didn't have the codes to those nuclear weapons, so it was basically useless. That's like saying Italy or Turkey have or had nuclear weapons because the U.S. put nuclear weapons on their soil, but that was never the case, right? You could have nuclear weapons on your possession on your land, but if you don't have the codes to launch it, which is what matters, you don't have nuclear weapons. You just have it on your land, and that's a good that's a good benchmark that you could use if for instance you see someone talking about the Ukraine situation, and they're like, oh, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapon for America to protect it, but now America is not protecting it because of the Budapest memorandum, but technically they never did have nuclear weapons. So that's how you know a lot of people in the media, they just talking heads. They don't know what they're talking about, right? But they won't tell us that, right? It's the same thing. I'll do a show about that, but it's the same thing talking about, oh, we should create a no-fly zone or or a safe zone, whatever, shut down the skies. No, that's a bad idea. They don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so the first thing is they never had nuclear weapons, right? Because the thing that counts is the launch codes, and they never had that. That was in Moscow, right? Russia had that. They just wanted to remove the physical weapons out of Ukraine. That's one. Excuse me. Now, two, you could say, well, couldn't they have couldn't they get their scientists to work on it, and then later on they could have figured out the codes and then to launch it? Okay. First of all, let's just say that was the case. I don't even think you could hack a nuclear weapons and get the codes in, and now you're in possession of the codes. I mean, now you could, like I said, hack it, and then now you could launch it. That I don't even know if that's possible, but that would take years. And the thing with nuclear weapons is you got to maintain it. I think the next 10 years, that's one of the things that for the next 10 years, the U.S. is spending over $1 trillion upgrading its nuclear weapons. You got to maintain them, and Ukraine was in no possession to do that at that time. They just didn't have the money for it. I mean, the Soviet Union. That's one of the reason that it collapsed. was because it went broke. So imagine Ukraine, which was just a, I guess you could say a state. Well, it was a Soviet republics technically, which would be the U.S. version of a state, right? Just like you have Texas and whoever, right? So that so yeah, that's one, right? I mean that's two, and then three. If Ukraine were to say, "F this," we're just gonna starve ourselves, basically do what North Korea is doing, right? The level of sanctions that the US and everybody else basically would have put on Ukraine, by the time they figure out the codes, they couldn't maintain it anyways. So then, therefore, they never had nuclear weapons. So that's one of the things that a lot of people in the media that's talking about this situation, they don't know. It's either they don't know or they're willfully not letting you and I know this. I mean, it's basic, right? If you don't have if you're not in possession of the nuclear weapons, it's useless, right? I think the U.S. still have nuclear weapons in Turkey and Ursulik base, so I don't know how many people are guarding those nuclear weapons, but I know it's not more than the Turkish army, right? If they wanted to, they could have. Then they could just overpower the U.S. Troops and take over those nuclear weapons, right? They would be in possession of it. Then technically, they would have nuclear weapons. But no, that's not the case. If they were to do that, it would be useless to them because they don't have the codes. The codes are in Washington, the launch codes. So a lot of people in the media, they just don't know what they're talking about, right? So and I'll touch on this just a little bit. It's the same thing with the no fly zone. Do you know what goes into creating a no fly zone over an area as big as Ukraine? Right? I think Ukraine is a little bit bigger than Texas. Right? Can the US do it? Yes, they can. And please stop saying NATO, NATO, NATO. There's no NATO without the US. Right? And that's one of the things that I hate about um, the current one of the current climate that we're in right now. It's all these international um, bodies that we created, like the UN, NATO. It's not. It's mostly a few countries that's that's responsible for, just like the UN, NATO. The NATO is basically the US. 80% of NATO's powers is the US, right? And that's another thing is that the whole one of the whole grievances that Vladimir Putin has right now is because that he doesn't want um, Ukraine to join NATO, right? If the Budapest memorandum was correct, there would be no need. Everybody knows it was just a show. It didn't have any teeth, right? The 1994 Budapest memorandum, which states that Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, stating that the U.S., the UK, and Russia, somewhat France and China, would help protect these countries if they give up their nuclear weapons, the nuclear, not their nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapons that it was on their land. Because at that point, when during the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the biggest concern that the world had was that they were worrying about nuclear weapons falling in the hands of a terrorist state like Al Qaeda or something like that, right? Or the know-how, and especially there were that's one of the things that the US did, especially the US, was that they were providing jobs for a lot of scientists, nuclear scientists at that time, giving them financial aid so that they wouldn't go ahead and work for uh, a rogue regime, especially in North Korea at that time, because that was in 1994, early 1990s. North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons back then, so they were providing these scientists grant, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that that's why they signed the 1994 Budapest memorandum, right? But everybody know it was just a show, right? I mean, you mean to tell me the U.S. is going to go ahead and fight for Belarus right now? Belarus was on it. It was Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine that had nuclear weapons on their soil. They had to give it back to Russia. The physical weapons, they didn't have the codes, which is what matters to launch those those nuclear weapons. Okay, yeah. So I think this is a live show. There's not going to be editing, and I am going to try to get better at this. So yeah, this is just a trick this is just something that you could use to, if someone is talking about that on TV and then they're talking about, Ukraine not having nuclear weapons, you could know if they're one of those that full of it because they never had nuclear weapons. All you got to do is do some basic research and have some basic knowledge of how nuclear weapons work, right? And that's something that I should have said at the outset of the show, is that I am not uh um uh I'm just an amateur historian, all right, and I'm not a nuclear weapons expert. And if I'm not that, even I know that. How come they can't? And you're supposed to be broadcasting the news. How come you don't know that? Anyway, that's just something to keep in mind. I'll do I want to do something about from the Russian perspective. Obviously, I'm not pro Russia. I mean, come on. But I'll do a show about Russia's perspective, Putin's perspective, I should say. All right. I mean, he's not all wrong. He's not a madman as a lot of people in the media like to portray him as. Right. He's not crazy going cuckoo. He just made a miscalculation. Right. It's just like when you play chess, when you make a blunder, you you you're not going crazy for making that blunder. You just made a blunder. It was just that. It was a mistake. You're not a madman. Anyway, although the stakes are much lower in a game of chess. But yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. The final analysis of this video is that Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. They were just in possession of it. They couldn't do anything with those nuclear weapons. They would just either cost them money or just rotting in the ground, and that would probably be a safety hazard for them, anyways. So yeah, keep that in mind. Comment below and let me know what you guys think.